It's funny how when you hold on to random bits of information and then they kind of sort of tie in together. I recently had conversations with some friends about when are you allowed to give advice? Because in our society, you're not allowed to give advice before you've done something. If you haven't done something, then you're not allowed to give advice on that thing. If you're in it and doing it and you give advice, well, you're doing it, so you can't really say anything about it. And then once you're finished doing it and you're not doing it anymore, or you're not in that anymore, and you give advice on it, it's like, well, you gave that up, you're not in it anymore, so you don't have the right to give advice on that. So that means that there is no time within our society where you can give advice. And that's been floating around in my head for months, trying to figure out how that works, how just floating around in there. I mean, don't even know. There is no how question or why question, just floating around in there. And today, listening to podcasts, of course, they were talking about and giving examples of times in history where stuff that is basic knowledge now was like, only one person was kind of saying it. I wish I could remember what podcast was. Actually a good one. But it was about how society is structured and about how people generally only take advice from people that they feel they have a connection with or something in common with, or they're from the same group of people, and that's how people get stuck in their cliques, in their groups of people, and why they get stuck in their information feedback loops and whatever. And the example that stuck with me the most that they gave was about, I'll put it really simply, and you can Google it or confirm it yourselves. Back in the day, 1800s or 1700s or whatever, there was a doctor. Well, there was a birthing clinic, like a clinic where women would give birth, and was a hospital as well, and they had they did all kinds of stuff there, and there was another birthing place nearby, and at the time there was this disease that was called some kind of birthing disease. They named it some maternity birthing disease, and it was fatal. And it was like some kind of infection that a woman would contract when she gave birth, and then she would die from this infection. And there was a lot more deaths in this one clinic than the other birthing clinic. And at the other birthing clinic, all they did was birthing. And at this clinic, they did lots of different stuff. And at this clinic, they dealt with a lot of dead bodies and did lots of autopsies. And he decided that there's probably a correlation there, because they're doing the autopsy and then someone would get rushed in pregnant, and then the doctor would go and deliver a baby. And this was before it was common practice to wash your hands. And so he made a correlation that there's probably some kind of something from the dead bodies that's getting passed to the mothers, and doctors should wash their hands in between going from one thing to another, or at least going from a dead body to a living patient. Shunned, laughed out of the practice. Everyone thought he was batshit crazy, and he researched it more, and no one would believe him, and they didn't believe that disease functioned that way. They believed everything was transferred by gases. They didn't think anything would transfer solidly, and he became so distressed by this, because he obviously realized the truth, that he was committed to an asylum or to a prison or some kind of thing that they had back then, where he ended up getting beaten by the guards and died of his injuries. Now, this was the first guy that came out publicly saying that doctors should wash their hands from touching a fucking dead body to a living patient. Now, the whole concept of this podcast was that, only when the majority of people, there's enough people saying the same thing, do the rest of the people believe it. So this sits in my brain for the last few hours, and had some trouble in public. The train in winter is proving too much for me. Oh, shit. I forgot. Doctors, washing, podcasts. Yeah. Giving advice. Give your advice. Whether you've done it, whether you're doing it, whether you haven't done it, whether you're out of it, give your advice. If you feel it is of benefit, do some assessment here. Obviously, if you're you're at some sort of extreme, whether it's you're like a hardcore vegan, or you're like a pro-life person, or you're like a something other extreme. Let's think about it: hardcore Christian, or you're a Satanist. You're in some kind of extreme of the big spectrum of life. But if you believe that you have well-rounded advice that's taken from a wholesome view, an holistic view, something taking in the whole picture, give that advice. But just don't expect anyone to listen to it at all. And when that pisses you off, just remind yourself that the majority of people didn't wash their hands from touching dead people to live people, and that took fucking years, and someone died for it. History is littered with stuff like this, so it's kind of like a cautionary tale as well as a learning tale. Give your advice so that the other people surrounding, because chances are this person will, if they end up getting offended by your advice, they'll talk about how this idiot tried to give them advice, and they'll talk to someone else, and that someone else might end up having the same thing as you, and that person will either hear that and be like, oh, that's interesting, someone else has the same thing, and not say it, or they'll say it to the person and be like, well, that's interesting, I actually kind of think the same thing, and maybe that other person will then respect this person a bit more, and they can have the non-conflicting conversation. But I think it's important that if you have advice, you should feel that you can spread it. Because something as simple as washing your hands turns out to change the world. So who knows what simple idea that you have, that little piece of advice fits into this puzzle.
It's over. Aw.